Hi, folks. It's the Bradley J. Show. Does the New Hampshire primary really matter anymore? Excuse me. Rich Rubino here. Political hotshot is here to tell us the answer to that question and give us some history on the New Hampshire primary. So, hi, Rich.
Hi, Bradley.
First, before we get to that primary, let's talk about just briefly the Iowa caucus and how it
Yes,
turned out compared to expectation. Very briefly.
yes. Well, Donald Trump broke the record for the biggest defeat of other candidates in a multi-party field. Bob Dole back in 1988. This was the second time Bob Dole had run. He ran in 1980, never got anywhere. He ran in 1988, and he ran in 1996. In 1998, he won it by 12.8 points over actually televangelist Pat Robertson. And then George H.W. Bush, the incumbent vice president, actually finished third in Iowa that year. This year, Donald Trump actually got an outright majority of the vote. Now, you can take that two ways. On the one hand, he got an outright majority of the vote, and he absolutely eviscerated the opponents. The other side of that is he's a former president, and you would think a former president potentially would get more than 50% of the vote in a Republican caucus. In terms of the other two candidates, I think they both very much underperformed. Ron DeSantis actually visited all 99 counties in the state of Iowa. It's called the full Grassley because Chuck Grassley, who's actually 90 years old, the incumbent senator from Iowa, visits all 99 counties every single year. Ron DeSantis did that. He came in a distant second. And Nikki Haley, who I think the expectations were was actually going to come in second place, came in a very close third. The other candidates, Vivek Ramaswamy and Asa Hutchinson, dropped out after the race. In the case of Ramaswamy, the next day he was in New Hampshire and gave a very gracious endorsement, if you will, of Donald Trump. But I think that certainly the other candidates underperformed. Nikki Haley, interestingly, in her concession speech or in her speech in Iowa, she said it's now a two-person race between herself and Donald Trump because the polling shows that Ron DeSantis is doing so poorly in the Granite State.
I see. And are either of those runners up going to drop out?
I don't think so. I think at least not through New Hampshire. In the case of Ron DeSantis, DeSantis is focusing more on South Carolina than New Hampshire. New Hampshire was never really his flagship state. He's focusing on South Carolina. He thinks that there are a lot of traditional conservatives that he thinks are going to go his way there. In the case of Nikki Haley, she actually could do very well in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is tailor-made for her message. There's a lot of suburban moderates, specifically some independents. About 45% of the electorate is expected to be independents, which is pretty much what it usually is, who vote for the Republican primary. That's the same constituency that allowed John McCain to upend George W. Bush by about 17 points back in 2000 after he lost to George W. Bush in the state of Iowa. The problem with Nikki Haley is whether she comes in close or even if she somehow wins New Hampshire, which is somewhat plausible, you can go down to South Carolina. South Carolina is her home state, a place where she's been elected twice as governor, and polls show she's losing her home state by about 30 points. Now, if you can't win your home state after that, how do you go to benefactors who are potentially going to give money to your campaign and tell them that they should support you for the rest of the campaign and that you have a pathway to victory? If you look at in history, for example, back in 1992, Tom Harkin was a senator from Iowa. He garnered 76.5% of the vote in the state of Iowa in the caucuses. No other candidate really gave a serious effort there. That's essentially how she should be doing. When candidates lose their home state, Jerry Brown lost to Bill Clinton in 92. In 2016, Marco Rubio lost to Donald Trump. And of course, in 2000, Elizabeth Warren actually came in a third place to Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders in her home state of Massachusetts. In all those cases, their candidacies were effectively over. So if she can't win her home state, which she currently is trailing exponentially, I don't see an avenue for her to come somehow then garner the Republican presidential nomination.
Okay. Is New Hampshire still the big deal that used to be when it comes to primaries? And how does it compare to what it used to be? And if there's a change, why the change?
I think it's very much relevant this time around. It's different to the respect that on the Democratic side, Joe Biden does not have his name on the ballot. So you ask why? Well, he spearheaded a movement in the Democratic Party that the Democratic National Committee ratified that would allow South Carolina to go before New Hampshire. He wanted South Carolina. If you remember back in 2020, He lost Iowa, he lost New Hampshire, he lost Nevada, and then he went to South Carolina, which is very much a tailor-made state for him. Many African Americans who supported him, more moderate voters. He won South Carolina, eventually wins the nomination. So we owes a lot to South Carolina. It was Jim Clyburn's endorsement. Jim Clyburn, member of the Democratic leadership, very instrumental in the African American community, that helped to put him over the top in South Carolina. The other argument is states like Iowa and New Hampshire are about 90% white, so there's not really much racial diversity there, where there certainly is in a state like South Carolina. So he wants South Carolina to go first, but New Hampshire has a statute on the books that they have to go before every other state. So what's going to happen? New Hampshire's still going to have their primary. The Republicans certainly are going to have their own primary, but the Democrats, there will be a primary ballot, and there will be names on that ballot. And some of those names include Dean Phillips, for example, the congressman from Minnesota. Marianne Williamson will be on there, and a bunch of other people you've absolutely never heard of who paid the filing fee to get their names on the ballot. About 36 people, actually. So there's going to be a campaign in New Hampshire. So there's a movement to put right in Joe Biden's name. Maura Healey, the governor of Massachusetts, Jamie Raskin, the congressman from Maryland, who's on the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, are very much instrumental in this because they don't want him to be embarrassed. There's precedent for this. 1968, Lyndon Johnson had a write-in campaign. He actually beat Eugene McCarthy, but only by about 6 points, and he ended up dropping out of the race. But the thought process right now is do not, in terms of the Democratic high command, if you will, is do not embarrass Joe Biden, write his name on the ballot, even though he would not actually win any delegates from New Hampshire, but New Hampshire only gives less than 2% of the delegates. So statistically, it's almost, it's basically inconsequential.
Was it a wise move to do that switch around with South Carolina?
From a political standpoint, I don't see how it really was for Joe Biden. First of all, the last thing you want to do is incense voters in New Hampshire. Now, voters in New Hampshire, once you get to the general election, are probably not going to be thinking back, well, Joe Biden, he wanted South Carolina to go first, so I'm going to vote for Donald Trump, gosh darn it. But the fact of the matter is New Hampshire is actually a showdown state in the general election. In South Carolina, if South Carolina is a swing state in the general election, then Joe Biden's probably going to win 40 states, which is unlikely to happen. It's not a swing state. It's a very red state. State he would not want to campaign in. But the fact of the matter is New Hampshire is very much a swing state. You don't want to do anything to alienate voters in New Hampshire, and you don't want to have this kind of weird tussle he has between Ray Buckley, the chairman of the Democratic Party of New Hampshire, and himself about whether New Hampshire should go first. It's just negative publicity you're getting in a state that's somewhat of a swing state.
Think they'll switch it back next time?
I don't think so, because I think that it's very hard now that they've brought South Carolina first to make the case for the New Hampshire delegates to say why a state that is 89% white should go before a state like South Carolina, when African Americans are really the bread and butter, or the wellspring, if you will, of Democratic votes, and certainly New Hampshire is not that.
Okay, so that's not strictly a Joe Biden tailored thing, and it might be useful for them in the future, maybe.
I think so. I think Iowa, the other one, it did Iowa for the Democrats. They disbanded the caucus because it was such a disaster last time around. Pete Buttigieg won the Iowa caucuses, and we didn't find out for about 2 weeks. That's one of the most important things about winning, is you get the momentum, you get the bounce, if you will. The next day, people are saying, wow, look how well Pete Buttigieg did. He gets on the front page of the newspapers. He didn't get that because the Democratic Party in Iowa screwed it up. So this time around, they actually had meetings, and they talk about other things involving the party, but they actually had a mail-in ballot. And people are not going to find out till March 5th what the preference are of Iowa caucus voters. So I think that the future of the Democratic Party probably will not be New Hampshire first, but the Republican Party will absolutely have New Hampshire first. But there will probably always be a New Hampshire primary first, even on the Democratic side, because New Hampshire has that law, and there's no possible scenario I can envisage where they will say, well, we're going to nix that law.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the history of that New Hampshire primary. There's have to be some key moments that took place as a result of that primary.
It's fascinating. Actually, so it used to be that all presidential elections were decided first by congressional delegations, then eventually it was by conventions. The first convention was actually formed for a major party. It was 1832. to get Andrew Jackson elected. There was the Anti-Masonic Party actually had one in 1831 for their nominee, which was William Ritt, the former Attorney General. But Oregon was trying to reform the system, give more democratization of the process, if you will. So in 1910, they formed the first primary. In 1912, other states continued. But you were not actually voting for a candidate. The candidate's name was on the not on the ballot. It was actually a number of delegates that you were voting for, who then you thought was going to vote for a certain candidate. So New Hampshire, which had basically gone first since 1920, the first New Hampshire primary, by the way, Leonard Wood, the inimitable Leonard Wood, actually won the nomination that year. He won the New Hampshire primary. Eventually went to Warren G. Harding at the convention. But they were basically beauty contests. They didn't really award delegates, and they were just basically saying, these are the delegates you want to award. So, have you ever heard of the name Richard Upton?
No.
Well, you never heard of him, but you should have heard of him because he was the Speaker of the House. In 1949, he comes up with this ideation. He says, what if we actually put the names of the candidates on the ballot? That will get to the people who are actually interested, and people actually come out to vote, because otherwise they're voting for John Smith, this guy they've never heard of. So they say, okay, we'll put the names of the candidates on the ballot. So all of a sudden in 1952, the names are on the ballot and candidates decide they're going to campaign there. Now, on the Democratic side, you have a very unpopular president, Harry S. Truman. Job approval rating is about 25%. The Korean War was just becoming was becoming a boondoggle, if you will. It was a no-win war. There was corruption in some of the Treasury Department administration, and the Chinese had taken over mainland China. So Republicans that year ran on Korea, communism, and corruption. That's what they talked about the Truman administration. So Truman. Truman, the question is, will he allow his name to be on the ballot in New Hampshire? And they went to him, originally said it's just Iowa, is kind of irrelevant, but eventually they agreed. They said, okay, if this is going to somehow help my campaign and my organization, put it on. So a lumber salesman from New Hampshire named James McPhail didn't fail, and he got his name on the ballot. So his name was actually on the ballot, incumbent president. Estes Kefauver, incumbent freshman senator for the state of Tennessee, who was doing hearings on the mob, who became kind of somewhat of a household word around the country, decides that he too will put his name on the ballot. He actually calls Truman. He thought Truman said he wasn't going to put his name on the ballot, but he put it on the ballot anyways. About 20 minutes before the deadline, Kefauver people got his name on the ballot. So Kefauver actually goes and spends time campaigning. Truman doesn't. He does retail campaigning, goes up to people and he says, hi, my name is Estes Kefauver. I'm a senator from Tennessee, and I'm running for president. One time he goes into a store and the counterman's there, and his mother rather happens to be there as well. The guy comes up and says, hi, my name is Estes Kefauver, and I'm running for president. And the guy looks at his mother and says, hey, Ma, this guy says he's running for president. He's actually serious about it. Another time he had a faux pas. He was going to a movie theater and he talked to the ticket guy, and he puts his hand to shake his hand right through that little loophole you got there, and he gets it stuck. He gets it stuck for about 3 minutes. A whole crowd's laughing. He's not laughing. Finally, he gets it out somehow, and then he gives it a little bit of laugh. But the point is, he does retail politicking. On election day, he defeats the incumbent president of the United States in the New Hampshire primary. Estes Kefauver wins. Harry Truman then says, I've done my time, and I'm not going to be a candidate in 1952. In his memoirs, he said he had made that decision before, but I think obviously he was embarrassed. And on the Republican side, Robert A. Taft, senator from Ohio, known as Mr. Republican, who would run in 1940, 1944, 1948, the son of former President William Howard Taft, throws his hat in the ring and runs. He's the establishment candidate. But there's also a movement to get Eisenhower's name on the ballot, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was actually working for NATO. He was in the military. He could not campaign. It precluded him from doing anything. He couldn't really even criticize the Truman administration. Bunch of surrogates got his name on the ballot, and he won the New Hampshire primary. Eventually, he leaves the military, runs campaigns for president, and runs for president. And eventually, you have a scenario of Eisenhower actually winning the nomination that year. On the Democratic side, Adlai Stevenson, the governor of Illinois, actually upended Kefauver at the convention, even though he never participated in the primaries. But the point is that made the primaries relevant. And ever since then, candidates have campaigned in New Hampshire. They know that this is a state that's first. It's not because of the number of delegates. That's numerically irrelevant. It's because you get a bounce and you're seen as relevant. And because of the precedent of 1952, it's become extremely important. And that's why you see so many candidates 3, 4 years before an actual race trying to find reasons to come to New Hampshire. Sometimes candidates will form political action committees. And then all of a sudden, the real thing they really care about is who wins a congressional seat or a state representative seat or a state Senate seat in the state of New Hampshire. Or they try to just figure out any way to visit it. That's why Iowa and New Hampshire go first.
At what point did the primary and then general election system come into being? In the beginning, you had George Washington he got to be president in probably a slightly different way. They just got together and said, "Will you be our president?" And he said, "I don't really want to, but I will." He did 2 terms, and then did it evolve, or did they make a rule? What happened?
That's interesting. It's in George Washington, ironically, in his farewell address that was actually written, not spoken, in 1796, he warned of the baleful existence of political parties. He didn't like them. But during his administration, Thomas Jefferson, who favored an agrarian republic, who favored less government interference with the markets, formed what was called the Democratic Republican Party. John Adams, the vice president, Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, formed the Federalist Party, which liked more power toward the federal government. So they've essentially formed, but you didn't actually have primaries. Oregon began it in 1910. Then in 1912, it was actually used specifically in the Republican Party. The Republican Party used the primaries. They had William Howard Taft as the incumbent president. Then they had Theodore Roosevelt running an insurrectionist campaign. Now, Theodore Roosevelt's been president after McKinley died from 1901 to 1909. At the time, there was no 22nd Amendment, so you could serve as many times as you want. He actually was his protege, William Howard Taft, won in 1908 the presidency. Then he believed that Taft was too conservative and he was not nearly progressive enough. So Theodore Roosevelt runs for president, participates in the primary, wins about 12 of the 15 primaries that year. In 1968, this was the last time that really happened. Eugene McCarthy, a senator from Minnesota who's against the Vietnam War, was campaigning and winning primaries. Lyndon Baines Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, did not announce his own presidential candidacy until April 27th of that year, not participating in primaries. Sometimes he would put up what's called a favorite son candidate, meaning in some of the primaries there would be a governor or a United States senator, some sort of elected official whose name would be on the ballot. People would vote for that person. They would then give their delegates to Hubert Humphrey. And Hubert Humphrey went to the convention, and many what today we might call superdelegates, folks of the convention, members of the Democratic Party high command, vote for Hubert Humphrey. So you have protests on the streets, McCarthy people, riots in the Grant Park in Chicago, Illinois, and that helped to lead to Humphrey's eventual loss that year. So the Democratic Party did not want to repeat that. They wanted to democratize the process, if you will. So they appointed George McGovern, a senator from South Dakota, and Darren Frazier, a congressman from Minnesota. They formed what was called the McGovern-Frazier Commission. And the McGovern-Frazier Commission comes out with recommendations to democratize the process. And one of them is that every state should basically have a primary and a caucus, and they should actually matter. So in 1972, this is where Iowa comes in, by the way, because they could not be Iowa, one of the states, they did not have enough hotel rooms in Des Moines when they're supposed to have their convention. Said let's have a caucus and let's do it earlier. So they did it earlier. A fellow named Gary Hart, remember the monkey business guy? Well, back in 1972, he was the chairman of George McGovern's campaign. McGovern was a 200-to-1 long shot. He says, I was going first. If we can get attention by doing well in Iowa, we're going to be considered a major party candidate. We're going to garner a lot of media attention the very next day. And he was right. So uncommitted comes in first in Iowa. Second place comes Edmund Muskie, the senator from Maine, who was the establishment candidate. Then George McGovern does a surprisingly strong finish in third place. Eventually, he wins the nomination because of his appearance in Iowa. But since then, delegates at the convention are very much superseded by how well candidates do in these primaries and these caucuses. And that's really where I think it became relevant. By the way, after 1972, Jimmy Carter took up the mantle McGovern did, spent an inordinate amount of time campaigning around Iowa. And then by 1976, he comes in second to uncommitted, eventually goes to New Hampshire, then wins the convention. And then Republicans are looking at this, and they're saying we should do the same thing. So they decide they're going to move their caucuses up earlier. So that's where that essentially came from.
Wow. So if I get it right, we went through all the 1800s without a primary system.
Yes. Up in 1912, Oregon was the
Yeah.
first state to act 1910 rather to actually pass a law establishing the primary system. By 1912, a normal amount of states started to have that, and then gradually we had primaries, but you also had conventions. So primaries were not necessarily the most relevant. 1960,
Yeah.
even, for example, John F. Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey were participating in the primaries. Kennedy was winning the primaries. It went to the convention, but then at the convention, Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas, Stu Stuyvesant of Missouri decided they're going to throw their hat in the rings and run for president at the convention, thinking they could win at the convention. But Kennedy, because of what he'd done in the primaries, was able to pocket the nomination that year.
So Lincoln's campaign, for example,
Yes.
just a convention.
Yep, and it was in his home state. It was actually in Chicago, and that's part of the reason he won. He brought a lot of people, homers there, if you will, to come to the convention. They start yelling and cheering for him. In Lincoln's case, he'd only been one term in the House of Representatives, been a state legislator before that, ran for the United States Senate 2 years earlier. At the time, you weren't directly running. It was really the Republicans versus the Democrats, and the Republicans said this guy will vote for if he becomes a United States senator. I mean, this guy will be our United States Senate candidate. The Democrats say the same about Stephen Douglas. Democrats win control of the legislature. Stephen Douglas becomes senator. But then 2 years later, Lincoln is one of many potential Republican presidential candidates. He runs, goes to the convention, and eventually wins at the convention.
Who's going to be the next president?
What a great question that is. And there are so many variables right now. I really have no ideation who it's going to be. I would say some of the possibilities. It could be Joe Biden. It could be Donald Trump. It could be Nikki Haley. I guess theoretically it could be Cornel West. I don't know. It could be Jill Stein on some level. This is really.
I mean, could it really?
No.
No, it couldn't. It couldn't. Could it be Cornel West? No, not really.
It's most likely going to be either Joe Biden or Donald Trump. And there are so many wild cards. And the wild cards, the reason I mentioned third parties, that's the wild cards. One of them is the no labels movement, which is trying to form a centrist candidate who will mobilize the middle. And who is that candidate going to be? Who will they potentially garner to take off votes from? There are really so many unknown factors. It's one of the most fascinating elections, really, in American history.
And the big question with that is mostly who would it hurt? That's the big question right there.
There are some. I say this is the most fascinating election since 1996 when they were debating whether the budget should be balanced based on. I mean, just to think about what's going on now. 1996 is whether the budget should be balanced based on using numbers from the Congressional Budget Office or the Office of Management and Budget, and whether the line item veto, school uniforms, curfews. That's what we were talking about back then.
School uniforms.
That was one of the issues because in the State of the Union in 1996, Bill Clinton said that school systems should be allowed to require students to wear school uniforms, and this really upended the apple cart because never have you seen a president of the United States focusing on such a hyper local issues like that.
Yeah.
And then he brought up curfews, and then he actually did a radio address talking about a program he had to bring cellular phones to neighborhood watchdog groups.
Interesting. As far as school uniforms, just for the record, I'm going to say yes. I like the idea of school uniforms. The reason being, I think the reason for it is poor kids, they can't afford fancy clothes, and that would level the playing field as far as appearance goes. I think. Anyway, anything else to know about New Hampshire primary?
I will say that one of the most there's a couple of really fascinating ones after 1952. The first one was in 1964. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., member of the Senate from Massachusetts, he was serving under a Democratic administration. He was nominated by President Kennedy, and Jacqueline Kennedy later said that part of the reason she appointed a Republican, he said that Kennedy had told her personally that the Vietnam War was a hopeless situation, so you might as well send a Republican there. But he was serving over there. And in 1964, there was a movement to get him on the ballot in New Hampshire. Now, just like Eisenhower, he could not make any statements about politics. This is like actual statute. And there was a war very similar to what's going on now between Trump and Nikki Haley. There was a liberal Republican, not that he was a liberal Republican, but similar. There was a Republican establishment candidate, and that was New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Then there was Barry Goldwater, very rock rib, old time religion conservative. Folks were looking for someone a little bit in the center, so they decided to put Henry Cabot Lodge Jr.'s name on the ballot in the state of New Hampshire. And guess what? He won. He never even participated. So they went to him in Vietnam. He was actually on an airplane over Southeast Asia when he heard the reason they had won by about 9,000 votes. And he said, they asked him about the results about the New Hampshire primary. He says, I can't comment about politics based on law. He said, well, are you happy today? He said, by nature, I'm a happy person. Eventually, they persuaded him to quit his job, and he participated in the primaries and lost. But this was absolutely fascinating how there was really a grassroots movement to draft him without him even campaigning. And the second one that's extremely relevant is 1968. I talked about what happened at the convention. But in the primary that year, just like this year, LBJ's name was not on the ballot. You'd have to write his name in. And there was a little known senator, Gene McCarthy. All his supporters went clean for Gene. They were a lot of them were young hippies because he was the anti-Vietnam War candidate. But when you go into the North Country, New Hampshire, going to Berlin, New Hampshire, they don't want to see that. So they went clean. And eventually, they shaved off their beard, they shaved their hair, and short hair. Eventually, McCarthy came within 6 points of defeating Lyndon Johnson. Eventually, Johnson drops out of the race. Very relevant New Hampshire primary that year.
This is a trivia question, and I don't know the answer. I just am curious about the answer. You may know it or you may not. What is the Baines in Lyndon Baines Johnson? Is that a family name, or do you happen to know where that comes from?
I believe it's a family name.
All right.
Oh, one more that's really relevant in terms of messaging. I'll just say this: 1992. Remember Jennifer Flowers?
Oh yeah.
With Bill Clinton.
Yes.
So Bill Clinton, when Mario Cuomo says he's not going to run for president, Bill Clinton becomes a front runner that year. Then Jennifer Flowers' story breaks. Bill Clinton goes down in the polls. He says, he goes to Bedford, New Hampshire. He says, I'll be with you till the last dog dies. He continues campaigns all over the state, goes to every mall. He comes in second place to Paul Tsongas, former senator from Massachusetts. And the next day, that night rather, he declares himself the comeback kid.
Right.
The next day, the story is not Paul Tsongas' win. He was from the neighboring state. It's that Bill Clinton is the comeback kid. He uses that, goes to Georgia, where Governor Zell Miller supports him, wins in Georgia, wins South Carolina, wins on Super Tuesday, and eventually wins the nomination.
Which, by the way, points out the importance of propaganda.
Yes.
It doesn't matter. I mean, it matters some what really happens, but what your statement the next day or your statement right after an election matters a lot. You say, I'm the comeback kid, whether or not you are. You say, I won Iowa, whether or not I was second in Iowa, whether or not you were. People see that. Lots and lots of people see that.
That was the first thing I thought of when I saw Nikki Haley saying that. I immediately went back to Bill Clinton declaring himself. And in Bill Clinton's case, there actually was some legitimacy for that because he'd gone behind Jerry Brown, Tom Harkin, and he was right down there with Bob Kerrey. But then because of his campaigning, his frenetic campaign, indefatigable, whatever that word is, campaigning, he eventually came in second, and he has a case to be made that he had actually did come back.
You can say Nikki Haley could have come out and said, because what people see is the statement. We got to get a statement. Yeah. They show the statement. Nobody reads the paper. And they show the statement. And Nikki Haley could have said, Donald Trump has decided to campaign as a woman. And that's there would be a certain section of the society that would that's what they would believe. Oh, really? Oh my God, that's wonderful. Or whatever.
That's why when you see candidates and you'll see sometimes the background, the candidate might be in Arizona and you see a picture of the Grand Canyon or something like that.
Yeah.
That's because a lot of people are not actually paying attention to what the candidate's saying, or it might say something like our candidate means jobs, something like that. That's all they're actually getting out of it. They're not listening to 30-minute orations. They get whatever's right there on the podium or behind them.
Did you see my old colleague Joe Matthew appeared in a political ad for Donald Trump?
No.
Oh yeah, there's one out there, and he's interviewing Nikki Haley, and he's very prominently. You can see him. It's like, that's right, the same Joe Matthew that it was my colleague at WBZ, and then went to WGBH, and now is with Bloomberg. He features front and center. You can probably Google it. It'll show up.
I'm going to do that. I want to see that.
Okay. Nikki Haley, she made a mistake back in the day. Seems like talking about, I'm going to revamp Social Security. People don't want Social Security revamped. She's had to eat crow on that one, kind of, and she's had to backtrack on that, and it was used against her by Donald Trump.
That's interesting. George W. Bush in his second term went all over the country trying to promote reforming Social Security. Got absolutely nowhere. The Democrats used it in 2006 as one of their major issues, that and the war in Iraq, and they landed up winning the House of Representatives for the first time in 12 years. Bush says it's shellacking. In 2016, Donald Trump knew he had learned that lesson. He knew that his supporters specifically are very populist. Many of them do. Many of them are very dependent upon Social Security. So he did not run a traditional kind of laissez-faire libertarian platform that says, "Well, we need to raise the retirement age" or something to that effect. He says, "No, we need to do. We're going to do nothing about Social Security." Only him and former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee did that and appealed to that populist wing. The result was he got a lot of blue-collar supporters who are not traditional conservatives to come and to support him. Other candidates were saying, well, we need to do something to restructure it. Even this time around, Mike Pence was saying the same thing. He got absolutely nowhere. So even in the Republican primary, if you still think of Republicans as traditional wealthy people who are traditional wealthy people who it's not what their party is. Donald Trump has reformed it. There are now many blue collar Republicans, but many of them, in order for them to support him on social issues, on other issues, they have to know that he's not going to do anything with, or for that matter, they believe they are some of them are dependent upon social services, and Trump's not somebody that originally comes in and says, I'm going to truncate this, I'm going to truncate this, I'm going to truncate that.
A similar issue is affordable health care. No right wing person wants to admit out loud that they like Obamacare, but they don't want it taken away, right? And as a result, we don't hear peep about affordable health care at all now, right?
And that's another fascinating issue. When it passed in 2010, 32 Democrats in the House of Representatives voted against Obamacare. Obama had to give basically everything to Ben Nelson, the senator from the conservative Democrat from Nebraska, in order to get his vote on that, and Mary Landrieu from Louisiana to get her vote on that. It was not popular at the time. Today, very rarely do you hear Republicans say, I want to reform, I want to get rid of Obamacare, or for that matter, something like, I want to reform it and replace it with something else. Trump tried to say something very similar to that. He kind of got pummeled for it. People know that it is now a popular program with the body politic. So consequently, you never hear it anymore. It's really changed the trajectory from what people were saying about it back in 2010 to what people are thinking about it in 2024.
And I'm guessing that the Republicans kind of wish the abortion thing didn't come up yet, so they could still be pounding on it. But now that it's already a thing,
yep,
they can't really touch it because it's so. It turns out that the abolition of abortion is unpopular.
And Nikki Haley is one person that knows that. That's why Republicans usually they'll say something to the effect of, well, when they talk about Roe v. Wade, they'll say, well, I believe it should be a state issue, as opposed to talking about the actual merits of the issue. They know that in the last congressional election, many Republicans lost their seats or tried to run for congressional seats, lost because of that, because of the Dobbs decision. Abortion is one of those issues. Most Americans are kind of in the middle about it. When you say, would you take away all abortion rights? Most Americans would say no. And they say, do you think you should criminalize the woman involved? Most Americans would say no. But on the other side of that, they'll say, well, do you favor late-term abortions or something to that effect? Or do you think there should be parental notification? That is where Americans tend to say that they support that type of stuff. But when you go to and Donald Trump has said this too, you have to win elections. And when you go too far to the right on the issue of abortion, there are many suburban women, for example, suburban women who are otherwise sympathetic to the Republican cause that are going to be very much turned off by that.
I guess my point is they'd would rather have that as a cudgel than an actual policy enforcement. They'd rather have the abortion legal and be able to beat up on the left for it, much like they don't want to solve, the right doesn't really want to solve the immigration problem. They'd rather have it be a weapon rather than a solved problem.
Well, I would say, though, in abortion, though, I think most Republicans, though, just want the issue to go away. They don't want to have to address it. That's why when they're asked about it, they immediately shift and they say, "Well, I think every state should be able to decide that." And then they're asked questions by their base in a primary. They know that they're, on one hand, they have to talk to their base because they have to get their support in the primary, but they know in the general election that they're going to be excoriated or disparaged for that. So it's a very delicate balance, and I think most of them would not want to talk about abortion unless you're running in a very socially conservative state, specifically in a primary. If you're running for a congressional seat in Southwest Arkansas, for example, then it actually might be something that's going to benefit you in the primaries. Whereas Democrats on the other side of that, many of them want to talk about the issue, and I think they were from a pure, calculated Machiavellian political standpoint. They know that it benefits them, specifically with suburban women who would normally be more sympathetic for the Republican candidates.
Philip Kate, I'll end up with this. Philip Kate makes a comment. They'd prefer, like medicine, to not to cure it, but to treat it, to continue treating it forever.
That's a great quote, and that is politics forever. You talk about whether it's immigration or abortion. It's all very much about getting from point A to point B electorally, and everyone's looking about how they're going to stay in office or how they're going to go from one office and jump to another office. And if they can use something to exploit and make it political football, if you will, most politicians wanting self-preservation, the first rule of human survival, are willing to go that route.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rich Rubino, and congratulations to you for getting more and more traction nationally. Now you're working for 3 national organizations or something like that. Who are you working for?
Well,
what are you doing?
Yep, I've been going on Newsmax, News Nation, and Scripps News now.
Scripps News. How does that skew politically?
And of course, it all got the start on Jay talking. But
is that true?
I think it assisted in it. Yes.
Like many greats, the Bradley J show is their launching pad.
The stepping stone. Yes. It's a gangway.
So those papers, how do they skew politically?
Scripps and News Nation are very centrist, and Newsmax is very conservative.
It seems like you appeal to the conservative crowd.
I don't know I don't know. I mean, Scripps and News Nation are very moderate. I'd love to go on to some more center left or liberal networks as well. It's just a matter of who's kind of finding me right now. But I certainly don't exhibit a ideology when I do this.
Yes. So Philip Kate suggests when you get to the top and you're covering the White House and stuff, maybe I can get a tour.
Yes, absolutely.
I can get a behind-the-scenes tour.
And if I ever land up prison, I'll let everyone come and visit me there as well.
All right. So it's Rich Rubino, political hotshot. Do you like that? I kind of like saying that instead of political historian.
Yes, it's
kind of sexy.
It's very apropos. Yes.
Political hotshot. Rich Rubino talking about the state of the nation politically, and in specific, the New Hampshire primaries and their relevance. I'm looking forward to next time. As always, thank you very much. And folks, share this. Phil, share this. Everybody share this. Thank you. Bye now. Let's end this baby. And we'll be ending in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1/2. Almost done.